The splintered gray post creaked as Naomi Hartwell dragged it from the ditch beside the county road, and Ezra Colby watched her from his porch with the particular disbelief of a man who had seen most things in this valley and thought himself unsurprised by any of them. She had been at it 3 mornings running now, hauling broken fence rails and rotted posts back to her wagon, stacking them with a care that made no sense to anyone who passed her on the road into town. By the time this story reaches its end, the same men who laughed at her from that porch will be standing on her land with their hats in their hands, and not one of them will remember why they ever thought a widow with a broken fence and a dead husband's ranch could not outthink the whole valley. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. If you want to see how a woman with nothing but a failing homestead turned everyone's scorn into silence, stay with this story. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the time, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Naomi had buried her husband, Walton Hartwell, in the spring, in the same plot of hard clay soil where his father and grandfather had been laid before him. And she had spent the summer since learning exactly how much a person did not know about running 200 acres of scrubland until they were the only one left to run it. Walton had died the way most hard things happen in that country, suddenly, and without any regard for whether the people left behind were ready. Thrown from a horse, spooked by a rattler in the low pasture, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March. And Naomi had spent the first weeks of her widowhood simply trying to remember which drawer held the ledger book and which fields still needed the spring planting he had never gotten to finish. She had married him 5 years before, a girl of 23, come west from a family with more mouths than money, and she had loved him in the plain, working way that people in that country loved each other, not with grand declarations, but with shared labor and shared silence, and the particular tenderness of 2 people who trusted each other to carry their half of a hard life without complaint. He had taught her to read the weather off the color of the western sky, taught her which of the cattle would calve early and which would need watching, taught her the slow rhythm of a ranch that demanded everything and gave back only what a person was willing to fight for. None of it had prepared her for doing the fighting alone. The ranch sat at the low end of the valley, where the creek that fed every other property upstream arrived thin and tired, if it arrived at all, and where the soil had been worked so hard by 3 generations of Hartwell cattle that it had gone gray and stubborn, refusing to hold anything green for longer than a season. Walton's father had said once, in the dry way he said most things, that the Hartwell land had given everything it had left to give sometime before either of them were born, and that whoever inherited it would be inheriting a debt more than a property. Naomi had not understood the weight of that sentence until she was standing alone in the yard that first widowed spring, looking out over 200 acres that seemed to stretch farther and demand more with every day she faced them by herself. Her nearest neighbor, a widower named Otis Bramwell, who had known Walton since they were boys, had come by twice that summer to offer, in the careful language men used when they meant something else entirely, to buy the land off her before winter made the decision for her. "There's no shame in it," he had told her. standing at her gate with his hat against his chest. A woman alone can't hold 200 acres of dying ground. Nobody expects you to. I expect it of myself, she had answered. And that had been the end of the conversation, though not the end of Otis Bramwell's certainty that he was right. He was not the only one who came calling with the same offer, dressed in different words. A land agent from the county seat, a brisk man named Wendell Pruitt, who represented buyers Naomi never met and never particularly wanted to, rode out twice that summer with papers already drawn up, certain that a widow facing her first winter alone would sign whatever was placed in front of her, rather than face the ranch's failing ground by herself. "You'd do better selling now, while the land still has some value on paper," Pruitt told her the second time, standing in her kitchen with his hat still on his head, a discourtesy she noted and did not forgive. "Come autumn, when the ground shows what it really is, you won't get half this price." "Then I suppose I had better make sure the ground shows something worth paying for," Naomi said, and showed him the door with a politeness that left no room for a third visit. It was her husband's mother, a sharp and quiet woman named Ruth, who had come to live in the small back room of the ranch house after her own health began to fail, who had planted the idea that set the whole valley talking. Ruth had grown up on a farm in the eastern hill country before marrying into the Hartwell family, and she had told Naomi, on one of the evenings when her breathing was easier and her mind was clear, about a method her own grandmother had used to bring dead soil back to life. It involved patience and rotted wood, and years most people did not have the stomach to wait out. "Wood breaks down slow," Ruth had said, her hands folded on the quilt across her lap, "but it breaks down rich. Every old post and rail rotting in a ditch is a season of soil somebody's letting go to waste. My grandmother built her whole garden out of what other folks threw away." Naomi had turned that idea over for a week before she understood what it meant for her own 200 acres of gray, exhausted dirt. The valley was full of broken fencing. Every hard winter took down another stretch of rail. Every dry summer split another post down its grain, and nobody bothered hauling the wreckage anywhere but the nearest ditch, where it sat rotting into nothing anyone valued. She began collecting it in the last week of summer, loading her wagon with splintered rails and shattered posts from every stretch of abandoned fence line she could find within a day's ride, and she did not explain herself to anyone who asked, because she was not yet certain herself that the idea would work. Her first stops were the long neglected boundary lines out past the old Kestrel property, a stretch of fencing abandoned when the family who owned it had given up and moved on to California some years before, leaving behind rail after rail of gray, weathered wood sinking slowly into the weeds. Naomi worked those ditches alone in the early mornings before the heat set in, loading the wagon until the axles groaned, and she came to know the particular ache of hauling waterlogged timber by hand, the way splinters worked themselves under her nails no matter how careful she was, the way her shoulders burned by mid-morning and did not stop burning until well after supper. The first neighbors to notice were the ones with the least patience for anything that did not resemble the way things had always been done. A rancher named Otto Renner, who ran cattle on the property adjoining hers to the north, stopped his horse on the road one morning and watched her load a splintered rail onto her wagon with an expression that made no effort to hide his amusement. "You building yourself a bonfire, Mrs. Hartwell?" he called out. "Because that's about all that wood is good for." "Maybe I know something you don't," she said, without stopping her work. And Otto Renner laughed the particular laugh of a man who could not imagine that being true, and rode on toward town to tell whoever would listen that Walton Hartwell's widow had taken to collecting garbage off the roadside like a woman who had lost more than her husband that spring. By the time the leaves began to turn, half the town had heard some version of the story, embellished a little further with each retelling, until the tale making the rounds at the mercantile was that the widow Hartwell had filled her barn floor to the rafters with rotten fence wood, and meant to build some kind of shrine to her dead husband out of it. Naomi heard the rumor from the mercantile owner's wife, a kind but gossipy woman named Prudence, who repeated it to her apologetically, as though passing along an insult she did not fully believe but felt obligated to report. "Let them talk," Naomi said. "Talk doesn't grow anything, and it doesn't stop anything either." There was a Sunday that autumn when the talk found its way into church itself, murmured behind cupped hands during the hymns, and Naomi had sat through the service with her spine straight and her eyes forward, refusing to give the whispering the satisfaction of a reaction. Afterward, on the church steps, a rancher's wife named Cordelia Ashworth had approached her with the particular concern of a woman who believed she was doing a kindness. "We only worry for you, out there alone with such strange notions," Cordelia said. "Grief does peculiar things to a mind." "My mind is fine," Naomi said. "It is my fields that need tending, and I intend to tend them in whatever way gets the work done." What she was actually doing, in the weeks that followed, bore no resemblance to the rumors. She had chosen the driest, most exhausted stretch of pasture on the ranch, a quarter-acre near the creek bed that had not held a green blade of grass in 3 years, and she began breaking the collected wood down by hand, splitting the larger posts into smaller sections with a hatchet, until the pile resembled less a wood pile and more a heap of kindling waiting for a fire that never came. She layered the broken wood into long, low mounds across the exhausted soil, packing it down, then covering it with whatever organic waste she could gather, spoiled hay, ash from the hearth, manure from the few cattle she still kept, building the mounds up in layers the way Ruth had described from memory, a technique her grandmother had called hugel building, though Ruth herself was not entirely certain of the word, and Naomi had never heard it before in her life. The work took the better part of 6 weeks, and it left her hands split and calloused in a way that no glove could fully protect against. And there were evenings when she sat on the porch step with her palms aching and wondered whether Otto Renner and Otis Bramwell and the rest of the valley were not, in fact, entirely right about her. She would look out at the quarter-acre in the fading light, at the long, low mounds that looked, to any honest eye, like nothing more than piles of buried trash waiting for a wind to scatter them, and she would feel the doubt settle into her chest like a stone she had swallowed and could not cough back up. But Ruth watched from her chair by the window each evening as Naomi came in from the fields, and there was something in the old woman's silent attention that kept Naomi from giving the doubt more room than it deserved. "You are doing the work my grandmother did with her own 2 hands, Ruth told her one evening, when Naomi came in smelling of ash and turned earth. Nobody believed her either, until the years proved her right. Years are a slow thing to wait on, but they do eventually arrive. The first real test of the work came in October, when a storm rolled down out of the northern hills with a violence the valley had not seen in years. 3 days of driving rain that turned the road into a river of mud and flooded the low pastures along every property in the county. Naomi spent the worst night of it awake, listening to the rain hammer the roof and thinking of her mounded rows of buried wood down by the creek, certain the water would tear them apart and wash 6 weeks of labor into the swollen creek bed along with everything else. She sat up with Ruth through the worst of the thunder, the old woman's breathing shallow and quick in a way that frightened Naomi more than the storm itself, and she did not know, in the darkest hour of that night, which she was more afraid of losing. When the rain finally broke on the 4th morning, she walked down to the quarter-acre with her boots sinking into the mud at every step, bracing herself for ruin. What she found instead surprised her more than the storm itself. The mounds had held. The buried wood beneath the soil had done exactly what Ruth described, soaking up the excess water like a sponge instead of letting it run off and gully the exposed ground, the way it had done to every other pasture in the valley. Where Otto Renner's low fields had washed out in ragged brown scars that would take a season to heal, her quarter-acre sat intact. Darker now, richer, the soil holding a moisture and a give to it that the rest of the ranch's gray dirt had never had. She knelt in the mud and pressed her palm flat against one of the mounds, feeling the give of it beneath her hand. And for the first time since Walton's funeral, she let herself cry. Not out of grief this time, but out of something closer to relief. It was the first sign that the idea might actually work, and it came at a cost she had not anticipated. Ruth's health, already fragile, worsened sharply in the wet cold that followed the storm. And there were nights that autumn when Naomi sat beside her mother-in-law's bed until dawn, uncertain whether the old woman would see the spring at all. It was during one of those long nights that Ruth, her voice thinner than it had been even a month before, made Naomi promise to see the work through regardless of what came. "You've got something here worth finishing," Ruth said. "I won't have you quit it on my account." "I'm not quitting anything," Naomi told her, and meant it, though the promise felt heavier in the dark than it had in daylight. Word of the storm's damage traveled through the valley faster than any harvest news, and it was not long before the county's agricultural surveyor, a methodical young man from the territorial office named Percival Whitfield, arrived to assess the flood damage on behalf of the county board, which was considering relief measures for the ranchers hardest hit. He worked his way down the valley, property by property, cataloging washed-out fields and eroded pasture, and when he reached the low boundary between the Renner spread and the Hartwell ranch, he stopped his survey entirely and simply stood, looking at the line where Otto Renner's ruined field ended and Naomi's intact quarter-acre began. "What did you do here?" he asked her when she came down to the creek to see what had brought a stranger onto her land with a notebook in his hand. "Buried old fence wood under the topsoil," she said. "Built it up in mounds before I planted anything." Percival Whitfield crouched at the edge of one of the mounds and dug his fingers into the dark soil, working it between his fingers with the focused attention of a man who had studied agricultural methods in a formal way most ranchers in this valley never had access to. "This is a method they've written about in some of the European farming journals," he said. "Buried wood holds water through a dry season and releases nutrients as it breaks down over years, not seasons. I have read about it, I have never once seen it done." He looked up at her with an expression that held none of Otto Renner's scorn or Otis Bramwell's pity. "Where did you learn this?" "My husband's mother," Naomi said. "Her grandmother did it on a farm back east." "It should not work as well as it clearly has," Whitfield said, standing and brushing the dark soil from his hands. "Not on ground this exhausted, not in one season. But I am looking at the results, and I cannot argue with what is in front of me." He paused, studying the long rows a moment longer. "If I write this up honestly, the board is going to want to see it themselves." "Let them come," Naomi said. "There is nothing here I am ashamed to show anyone." He returned twice more before the month was out, bringing with him a colleague from the territorial office, a soil specialist named Augustus Feld, who examined the mounded rows with the same careful attention and left with samples of the buried wood packed into a wooden case, promising to write up the method for the Territorial Agricultural Bulletin. Feld was a quieter man than Whitfield, given to long silences while he worked, and it was nearly an hour into his examination before he spoke to her directly at all. "You understand what you have built here," he said finally, straightening from where he had been kneeling at the edge of the deepest mound. "This is not luck. This is a system. Water storage, slow-release nutrition, structure the soil itself never had. Most men who call themselves farmers in this territory could not explain to me why this works even after I told them." "I did not need to explain it," Naomi said. "I needed it to work." The explaining came after. Word of the visits spread through the valley faster than the original rumors had, and this time the story that reached the mercantile bore no resemblance to shrines or grief-addled widows. This time it was a story about a government surveyor standing on Naomi Hartwell's land with his hat off, asking her to explain something he had only ever read about in a book. Otto Renner heard the new version of the story from 3 different people before the week was out, and pride being a slower learner than curiosity, it took him another 2 weeks before he rode out to the Hartwell ranch himself, dismounting at her gate with considerably less certainty than he had carried the day he laughed at her from the road. "Heard the surveyor was out here," he said, turning his hat in his hands. "Heard he thinks a lot of what you've done." "He does," Naomi said, and did not elaborate because she had learned by then that the work spoke more plainly than any explanation she could offer. "My low fields still torn to pieces from that storm," Otto said. "Might be foolish of me, but I'd take it kindly if you'd show me what you did down there. If there's a way to keep it from happening again come spring." It was not an apology, not in so many words, but Naomi understood it as the closest thing to one that a man like Otto Renner was capable of offering, and she found she did not need the words themselves nearly as much as she had once imagined she would. She walked him down to the 1/4 acre and explained the layering the way Ruth had first explained it to her, and Otto Renner, who had laughed at her from his saddle 2 months before, listened with his hat in his hands and asked more questions in that one afternoon than he had asked anyone about anything in the better part of a decade. By the following spring, the 1/4 acre by the creek was producing vegetables in a soil so transformed that visitors who had seen the exhausted gray dirt the year before found it difficult to believe they were looking at the same ground. Naomi had expanded the method to a full acre over the winter, hauling more broken fencing from every property owner in the valley who was now, rather than mocking her collection, eager to have her clear their ditches of wreckage they finally understood held value. Even Wendell Pruitt, the land agent who had once tried to buy the ranch out from under her, wrote asking whether she might be interested in selling cuttings or advice to other landholders he represented, an offer she declined without much regret. Ruth lived to see the first planting come up green across the expanded rows. Sitting in a chair Naomi had carried down to the edge of the field so the old woman could watch the seedlings break the surface of soil that had been considered worthless only a year before. She passed quietly that summer, in her own bed, with the window open to the fields she had helped bring back to life, and Naomi buried her beside Walton in the family plot, understanding that the old woman had left her something far more lasting than the ranch itself. The Territorial Bulletin published Augustus Feld's account of the method that autumn, crediting Naomi Hartwell by name as the rancher whose ingenuity had revived exhausted pasture land using a technique nearly lost to memory on this side of the country. And ranchers from 3 counties over began making the trip to see her fields for themselves, walking the rows with the same careful attention Percival Whitfield had shown that first afternoon. Otto Renner brought his own damaged fields back using her method the following spring, and Otis Bramwell, who had once stood at her gate offering to take the ranch off her hands, sent word asking whether she might consider consulting on the restoration of his own worn-out pastures, an offer that arrived with no trace of the pity it would have carried a year before. The valley organized a small gathering that October, a year to the week after the storm that had first tested her mounds, and it was held, at the insistence of nearly everyone involved, on the Hartwell Ranch itself. Ranchers and their families walked the rows Naomi had built with her own hands, and Cordelia Ashworth, who had once worried aloud about grief doing peculiar things to a mind, stood at the edge of the full acre with an expression Naomi did not think the woman capable of, something close to admiration. "I judged you unfairly," Cordelia said quietly, when the crowd had thinned. "I am not too proud to say it plainly. There is no debt owed for it," Naomi told her. "Only the ground itself needed convincing, and I believe it has done that better than I ever could have with words." Naomi stood at the edge of her fields on a clear evening the following October, exactly 1 year after the storm that had tested everything she had built, and watched the last light settle gold across rows of grass and vegetables where nothing but gray, exhausted dirt had once refused to hold anything green. She thought of her husband, who had died believing the ranch would likely die with him, and of Ruth, who had handed her the one idea capable of proving him wrong, and she understood something about worth that she suspected most people never had the occasion to learn as clearly as she had. The things a place throws away are rarely as worthless as they look. It is only ever a matter of who is willing to look twice, and who is willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of turning waste back into something worth having. If this story reminded you that the things everyone else overlooks are sometimes the very things worth the most, let us know in the comments what part of Naomi's story stayed with you the longest. If you enjoyed watching a whole valley learn to see a woman they underestimated, make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications turned on, because there is another story just like this one waiting for you very soon. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we will see you in the next story.